The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Debate Review Part 2 for Matt Dillahunty versus Jay Lucas. So in the first video, we took a look at the opening statements from this debate. In this video, we'll take a look at highlights from the rebuttal statements, or the second statements in this debate, as it turns out. And then in the final video on this debate review, we'll take a look at the cross-examination period. Now, as we saw in the opening remarks, Jay made the somewhat unusual claim that he was going to be specifically defending the Christian notion of God. Now, set aside the fact that there are many different notions of God within Christendom, because you have over 1,000 denominations who disagree on every point of doctrine, and yet they all identify as Christian. But, you know, we can take this to mean that Jay is going to defend at least his specific notion of Christianity. Unfortunately, as we saw in the opening remarks, he really only presented a single argument, his version of an argument from morality, that there are objective moral standards and that the only explanation for this is God. But his argument does not in any way limit itself to only his version of the Christian God. This moral argument is used for a variety of different versions of the Christian God and non-Christian gods. Basically, the argument is we need some external source of morality in order to claim that it's objective, so that we're not just, you know, willy-nilly picking and choosing. And his argument, there's nothing about it that ties it to Christianity. The argument that I presented was not an argument for the non-existence of God. And I'll talk about this at another time, about how I'm essentially arguing for skepticism. I'm arguing for the God claims have not met their burden of proof. And so because of this, I basically gave an explanation of the default position, the burden of proof, the nature of evidence, and that the time to believe something is after the evidence is established, that it would be reasonable to accept the claim. That was my entire case. And as we move into the rebuttal rounds, I think it's important to note right off the bat that in the program and in the schedule for this debate, this wasn't listed as a rebuttal round. It was listed as a second statement. And I was relatively new to this, and I just looked at that and said, oh, okay, here's our opening statements, here's our second statements. That must be the rebuttal, because nowhere else in the program is there a rebuttal period. And it turns out that Jay viewed this as just an opportunity to make an additional statement, and never intended to actually offer a rebuttal. And I'm not going to fault him for that. He, you know, followed the layout and structure of the debate as it was written, as he understood it. But to me, a debate without a rebuttal is useless. I mean, you might as well have not bothered to show up at all. It could just be, hey, here's my statement, here's my statement, here's my other statement, here's my other statement. The idea of a second statement doesn't make any sense to me, except in the context of a rebuttal or a redirect. Now, if you're going to offer a rebuttal, you need to quickly summarize what your opponent's position is, the argument that they've presented. And then you have to make some attempt to show why that position is either flawed. Is there a logical fallacy involved? Have they made, you know, some mistake? Is it just not convincing? What will we expect in order to be convinced by this? And so if we were to try to figure out what Jay would need to do to rebut my position, he'd have to begin by acknowledging that I talked about the default position, the burden of proof, and the nature of evidence, and my position is that the God claims have not met their burden of proof, and therefore belief isn't justified. In order to offer a satisfactory rebuttal for this, he has to do one of about four things. There are potentially others, but these are, I think, the main four. He could argue that my entire opening statement was incoherent, that it was babbly, that it didn't make any sense, and therefore there's no substantive content there for anybody to respond to. I think that's clearly not the case, and I think Jay would agree that my opening statement wasn't incoherent, but you'd have to ask him. And so, moving on to the actual substance of rebutting what I said, he would have to demonstrate why I'm wrong about what the default position would be, something that Blake Junta disagrees with. I hope to have that conversation with him at some point. But Jay could show that I'm wrong about what the default position is. He could show that I'm wrong about the burden of proof. And he could show, or he could show, that I'm wrong about whether or not that burden of proof has been met. But Jay doesn't do any of these things. In his second statement, he begins by expanding his original argument. And I'm going to take a look at highlights of what Jay says and comment on bits and pieces of it. But it's important to know that none of this new information does anything to specifically bolster any specific Christian God, his or someone else's. These are all just general deistic arguments that he happens to attribute to his God. He talks about how, you can't have an objective moral foundation without a God. And he means the Christian God, but what he doesn't seem to understand is that this would also apply to a variety of other different views of the Christian God that don't match his own, and a variety of other gods, a Muslim God, etc. You could use the same argument, this moral argument, to back up any number of gods. And the interesting thing to me is that it fails for all of them, for all of the same reasons. There's no demonstration on his part that these problems that he's listed are actually real, or that his proposed solution actually resolves it, or that no other position could possibly resolve it. What I mean by that is, if you're to say, here is a state of affairs, this is the best and only explanation for it, and no other explanation can suffice, then you have to show that the state of affairs is actually true as you present it. You have to show that your proposed solution is in fact a solution to the problem. And you have to demonstrate that no other proposed solution could possibly be a solution to the problem. Jay does none of those things. In his opening statement and in his second statement, all he does is make assertions, appeals to consequences. If there's no God, then we don't have this or this or this or this. There's no demonstration of why this is the case. There's no demonstration that his proposed solution resolves it. And there's no demonstration that other proposed solutions couldn't also resolve it. So let's take a look at some of his remarks from his second statement.
As I said earlier, Matt is an outstanding spokesman for atheism. And you just heard firsthand why the Secular Student Alliance thinks so highly of him. In keeping with my opening statement, let's now assume, for the sake of the argument, that the case that Matt just presented for the non-existence of God is compelling. I don't believe it to be compelling, but nevertheless, let's just grant that he made his case. Now that we've given up God, there are many other things that in order to be rationally consistent, we must give up as well.
So I think the first interesting thing to note is that this is a pre-prepared statement that he's essentially reading. Outside of the side debate, I don't write prepared statements either for rebuttals, definitely not for rebuttals, but really I don't write them for openings either. I'll have a rough outline. The reason you don't write your rebuttal ahead of time is because you're supposed to be responding to what your opponents actually said. Now, as we noted, this is a second statement and not necessarily a rebuttal, so I can't really ding him for having prepared a second statement, except for this. He begins his second statement by talking about the case that I presented for the non-existence of God. Except, as I pointed out earlier, I didn't present any such thing. It's not my objective to disprove a God. It's not my objective to present a case for why we should conclude that there are no gods. My objective is to present the case for why we should not conclude that there are gods, why their claims haven't met the burden of proof. And so if you're going to do a prepared statement that you're going to read, you should make sure that it doesn't include statements about what your opponent has done unless you're sure that your opponent has done them. And so when he says, let's pretend that the case Matt gave for the non-existence of God, put on the brakes, because Matt didn't do that. So Jay didn't really prepare for what I was actually going to do and didn't adjust to it on the fly. So he read out a statement that was essentially false in order to keep going with his prepared statement. It shows that there wasn't a lot of attention paid to what I actually said, and that he doesn't intend to actually respond to what I've said, but he's going to go on by making additional claims. So let's look at some of those.
One of the first things to go is objective moral values, and perhaps you're okay with this. I've already quoted several atheist scholars who agree that morality is not objective.
So Jay starts off his second statement, which I viewed as a rebuttal, as by saying that if we give up God, we don't have objective moral values. This is nothing more than a restatement of his entire opening remarks, that we have to have objective moral values, and that the only solution for this is a God, and what he thinks is specifically the Christian God, even though that's not what he defends. If you're going to have a debate or a discussion with someone, one of the things that you should try to do is make sure that you are using terms in the same way. Otherwise, you wind up talking past each other. Jay's view is that because I have publicly stated that I advocate some system of objective moral values, that what we mean by objective moral values is then the same, and that's clearly not the case. What Jay means by objective moral values are that these values are derived from something which transcends nature and which isn't subject to any sort of opinion or impression or assessment. And so he views this as specifically the Christian God, although his argument isn't in any way tied to the specifics of Christianity. What I mean by objective moral values ends at nature, ends at the physical world. It is a recognition that as physical beings in a physical universe, there are consequences to our actions which are dictated by nature. They're not a matter of opinion. So if I cut off your head, that's bad for you in almost all circumstances, and that's not just a matter of opinion. Now, the strong or strongest objections to my particular view on objective moral values are that, number one, why should we bother caring about right and wrong? And I've answered this before. I don't find that objection to be particularly compelling or interesting because we do care. That's why we're having this discussion. And if I'm in a conversation with someone who says, hey, I don't see any reason to care about right or wrong, then there's no point in having the discussion about what makes up right and wrong, because that's something they don't care about. But we do care about this. We do have the conversations because we seem to care about what is right or wrong, and we may have different views of that. The value of the discussion is to say, if your view is entirely subjective, if it's a matter of opinion, if your assessment for saying that this is right or wrong is on a par with saying that chocolate ice cream is the best, that's a problem. We have to recognize that there are things that are not a matter of morality. There's no real moral substance or evaluation for your preferred brand of ice cream or which movie you think is better. Instead, we can appeal to objective facts. If we're evaluating a movie, I might like it, you might not. But instead, if we looked at the movie and said, hey, the cinematography here was superior to this one, that might be a matter of opinion. Or we might be able to say, that shot is out of focus. And then we have to have a discussion about whether or not it was intended for that shot to be out of focus, if there was some sort of statement, or if it was more likely to be an accident. And in some cases, we can go back to the filmmaker and say, hey, did you mean for that to be out of focus? Nope, that's just the way it was. It just happened to be the best take, and we decided to go with it. Who knows? But now we're moving beyond just what our opinion is of this, and we're talking about the actual facts. You know, was this out of focus? Did we accidentally get the back of someone's head when we meant to get the front of their head? You know, did we leave a boom mic hanging in the frame unintentionally? And those sorts of things can be used to build a non-subjective assessment of which film is better or worse with respect to that criteria. It tells you nothing about how much you liked it or anything else. He continues by saying that something's only wrong if the person doing wrong and you agree on whether or not it's wrong. Here.
That unjust, unethical, or immoral thing that was inflicted upon you can only be identified as being wrong if there is some standard that both you and the offending person is bound to or morally obligated to honor.
So there's a number of problems with this. First of all, sometimes people knowingly and willingly do things that they themselves acknowledge are wrong. So you can have a scenario where I think something's wrong and you think something's wrong, but one of us goes ahead and does it anyway. And we can agree that it's wrong. If in fact we disagree, and it's pretty rare that criminals don't agree that what they've done is wrong. They may want to, try to give some post hoc rationalization for why in this particular circumstance it was wrong, but they would probably agree that under general assessments, under a broad view of things, that this would generally be considered wrong. And you can make an argument situationally. And I'm a huge fan of situational ethics. When I talk about objective moral values, I'm not talking about unalterable absolutes that apply in every single situation. That sort of black and white thinking is what we get from religions. The lack of nuance is what objective moral values seek from a religious standpoint quite often. And the influx of nuance is what we see from more humanistic, secularist views, recognizing that as a general rule, it would be wrong to take a knife and cut your throat. But that there are situations, for example, if I'm giving you an emergency tracheotomy, under which it is the most right thing to do. In some cases, you might have somebody trying to argue for jury nullification, that yes, in fact, the defendant did in fact shoot this person, which under normal circumstances we would think was wrong. But under these circumstances, we want you to go ahead and say that it was justified, that he really didn't do anything wrong, despite the fact that he violated the letter of the law. And this is where we begin to distinguish between the law and morality. And getting the idea that there's a moral virtue that could trump a law is a response that people can use to advocate for why something they did, which they acknowledge would be wrong, wasn't wrong. He goes on to talk about arguing that anyone knowingly passing on an STD is morally right, under my view supposedly, because the pleasure that they derive from unprotected sex is the highest good. This is a complete, like, red herring dangling there. He's essentially saying someone could have the opinion that it's okay for them to knowingly spread an STD because the pleasure they get from having unprotected sex supersedes the other. But he's admitting implicitly that they're acknowledging that there is some wrong there. And what they're doing is saying, my preference for this outweighs this wrong. And that's an argument that we can have. That's an argument we can have and say, wait a minute, and this is a foundational principle of how I view morality. What kind of world will we live in if everybody did the action that I'm getting ready to do? What kind of world will we live in if everybody's justification for this action was the one that I'm trying to apply right here? And we can show that the world, in many cases, would be demonstrably worse off if we did that. And that's all we have to appeal to show that someone's personal opinion, or their stated personal opinion, is in fact wrong, and is in fact in conflict with what they actually already understand about it. And in the cases where we get someone who doesn't actually understand that or care about that, we, as the people who do care and understand, can still say this is wrong. We're never going to get to a point where there's not disagreement about the moral evaluation of things, but that doesn't mean that we just have to throw our hands up and say, oh, there's no solution, there's no right and wrong, it's all just a matter of opinion, we don't care. And he's going to expand this in other ways. He's going to talk about this.
In our atheist world, our only appeal is to some sort of utilitarian system. But because utilitarianism is subjective, it really has no moral oughtness attached to it. Oh, by the way, add the concept of moral oughtness to the scrap heap. It simply does not comport with secular systems of morality.
So this is something we've heard over and over again, that secular morality has no oughtness. They're beginning with this idea that you cannot derive an ought from an is, that you cannot look at the facts and make a determination about what you ought to do, what you should do. And that their view is that this is what morality is all about, determining what you ought to do. But First of all, I'd say that morality is more about determining which actions have consequences that increase or decrease well-being, and that evaluation is something that you can do, that you can derive from the facts, because we have the goal of well-being. And I would say that if you have a goal that you're trying to achieve, and the facts about reality, that you can in fact derive the preferred path or many different preferred paths, you can determine what you should do. If my goal is to start recording this video, I can then say, here are the facts about reality. Here's what I need to do to achieve recording this video. The idea that we can't derive that ought from an is, I get that. From the mere facts alone, you cannot derive the things that I ought to do to get to this video. But if you have this goal of recording this video and doing so in a certain time, making sure that it's out in February, you can then derive an ought from this. That's the difference in the viewpoint here on morality. They want to claim there's no oughtness. You cannot possibly derive what you should do. And that's because they don't see how you could have a goal. And I think that we do have a goal in well-being, and that it's a goal that is generally understood. I think people make morality a lot more difficult than it needs to be. And I think that religions pollute the conversation by defining objective moral values and oughtness in a way that is more about curtailing secular views of morality than it is about telling us anything informative about the best way to go about building a moral system. But we spent a lot of time on morality here, and there was more to his statement. So what else did he say?
In Matt's lecture on the superiority of secular morality, he said, quote, "Secular systems have as a goal the best interest of the participants," end quote. Really? Try telling that to the relatives of the millions of people killed in the secular system known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under the rule of Joseph Stalin and his successors. Can you hold the clock just?
Yeah, he actually did that. You can hear the crowd booing at the end of it. You're occasionally in a debate, you're probably going to irritate some people and you may get some negative reactions. The crowd booing doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong, but it might mean that you've made a horrible misstep. And Jay's made several. He, during his opening, asked people to remember something tragic that happened to that and then imagine that the person had gotten away with it. And during his second statement, he actually calls back to that 2 more times, not recognizing that he's made this error that has lost the audience, lost a good chunk of the audience. And now he goes and talks about Soviet Russia and immediately gets booed. I actually address this particular statement in my rebuttal, and so I'll just let that one stand and we'll get to that in a little while. But he's going to start listing other things that we have to give up if there is no God. What are they?
Let's look into that. You see, now that we have given up God, it is not just objective moral values that we must surrender. Objective human rights are now placed on the scrap heap as well.
So after morality, he lists objective human rights as the next thing that are gone if there is no God. And I'm pretty sure I agree with him, because I think what he's talking about is this idea of inherent human rights, that there are human rights that just exist somehow. The problem is this: rights are granted. That's a difficult fact for people to recognize, but rights are granted, they're protected, codified in law. And any right that isn't codified and protected, it is useless to say you have this right, when what you really mean is you are convinced that you should have this right. And when we agree that we should have a particular right, what we then do is have the discussion, convince people that we should in fact have this right, and then we codify it as a matter of law, and then it becomes a right, then it becomes protected. This is uncomfortable because people think, hey, I should have this right and I'm not being granted this right, so I'm going to fight for it. And I wholeheartedly support that. That's what we do quite a lot of the time. But there's a difference between the right that you think you should have as a matter of what improves your life, the life of society, what improves well-being in general, and what rights you do have. And I'm curious, because Jay is talking on behalf of the Christian God, what rights does Jay think we have? What inalienable rights exist under his model? If there's a God who created the world and has determined my lifespan and can take me out whenever he wants, then I don't have a right to life there. There's no intrinsic right to life. Jay's view is the same as mine. We have rights that he thinks God is granting us, and God can take them away. And yet he's going to object to this idea within secularism, within humanism, that in a world that doesn't recognize a God, rights are granted and they could be taken away. That's just terrifying. And he's confused what he thinks, the rights he thinks we ought to have, with the rights that we do have. And he's failed to recognize that his model is worse. It's at least no better. We the people grant these rights, the government, it's then codified and protected by the government, versus God grants these rights. The thing is, we don't have any way to, as far as we can tell, appeal to God, to affirm that God has granted these rights. And God doesn't seem to be doing anything to protect these rights. So under the Christian God, I don't see any recognition that I have a right to life. God could end my life whenever he wants to. Meanwhile, you could come in here and shoot me in the head and end my life, which means God didn't protect the right that Jay thinks he's protecting. His solution of appealing to God for universal human rights, or intrinsic, inherent human rights, is not better and may in fact be worse. At least in reality, we have the ability to petition the government for redress of grievances. We have the ability to go to court. We have the ability to set up a police force and a criminal system that imposes penalties for violating these sorts of things. Under Jay's model, I guess we just got to trust that eventually people are going to get what they deserve. Unfortunately, he's advocating for a religion that is in direct opposition to the idea that people get what they deserve. That none of us deserve heaven, but God's going to grant that to some people anyway. And that someone who has committed all sorts of atrocities that many of us might think could be deserving of a hell might avoid that because they accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. This mercy on God's behalf is a loophole, and perfect mercy is in conflict with perfect justice. You can't have mercy is a suspension of justice. It's the idea that you deserve this, but I'm going to let you have this anyway. And so we have a model where someone could live their lives entirely virtuous and not actually be a saved, redeemed Christian under whatever model of soteriology Jay accepts, and they would burn forever in hell or be annihilated, depending on your particular version. And somebody else who might be deserving of torment could end up in heaven. There's no justice in that system. There's no clear protection of rights either.
Now, in keeping with this view, Dershowitz goes on to say, quote, "We cannot endure without morality, law, and rights, yet they do not exist unless we bring them into existence," end quote. According to Dershowitz, rights are legal constructs devised by the minds of human beings. I hope everyone here recognizes that you have just lost any rationally consistent basis for universal human rights. They simply cannot exist in an atheist world, and that includes an inherent right to life. If you are an atheist, you cannot believe that you possess an inherent right to life.
And there he says it explicitly, that you can't believe you have an inherent right to life. And he's correct. I don't believe you have an inherent right to life, but I can believe that there's value in life and that there's value in all of us supporting a right to life. And that's all we need. And it's the only way that I can even imagine that you could have a right to life and protect that right to life, or at least set up a society that strives to protect that. There's no demonstration that we do, in fact, have any sort of inherent right to life in the way that Jay's advocating. And he's going to extend this even further than inherent human rights and a right to life. Here.
While we're at it, let's consider another thing that we must give up: justice, since morality, law, and rights do not exist unless we bring them into existence. Any standard we attach to the concept of justice is arbitrary and subjective and has no intrinsic or binding authority.
So now we've, according to Jay, have to give up a sense of justice, because justice is, under his model or his view, arbitrary and subjective. And I don't disagree with him. I don't fully disagree with him. The problem here is that, once again, he's not demonstrated that there is some sort of objective standard for justice. He hasn't demonstrated that the only way to get it is through a God, or that it's possible to get it through a God, or that it's tied to his specific God. And he doesn't demonstrate that there's no other way to get there. I would argue that we do, in fact, have a sense of justice, that whether or not it is arbitrary and subjective is irrelevant. But I don't actually think it's arbitrary. I think that what we mean when we talk about justice is a sense of fairness, a sense of permitting individual freedom, and recognizing when people have crossed boundaries to infringe upon other people's freedoms, the rights that we're granting. Our idea is we have granted these rights and we're going to serve to protect them. We're going to work to protect them. And our sense of justice is this idea that it is in our best interest to continue to defend and protect these rights. I don't know of a sense of justice that we need more than that. And we recognize that our view of what justice is shifts as we learn more about the physical facts. It's not just an arbitrary thing that we just pulled out of a hat. There's great discussions in the past, within reality, and within films and comic books and everything else, where we're having a discussion about what's the difference between justice and vengeance. Does this person deserve to die because they killed somebody else? And should I be the one to make that decision and actually end their life? Or are we better served by a system that isn't based on vigilante justice, and that is codified so that people have their rights protected, so that you have to make a strong demonstration that this person actually committed the crime, and then make an argument for what the penalty should be within that? And there's still a lot of discussion about something like the death penalty, a capital punishment. Is that permissible under any circumstances? Do we actually live in this sort of world where we can sufficiently establish someone's guilt that we can justify killing them? That's not a discussion for this particular video. But when he says we have to give up a sense of justice because it's arbitrary and subjective, I don't find it to be arbitrary at all. It seems to be based on ideas of fairness, which we can demonstrate. We can look at things, game theory, issues like the prisoner's dilemma and stuff like that, about how people think. And we can also look at the consequences compared to the goals. And if the goals are a society that is more productive, that isn't running around killing its citizenry or locking up people over petty crimes, or locking up people unfairly, where you have African Americans are more likely to be penalized in this way for this crime than Caucasians are. These sorts of biases in the system can be overturned by a recognition that justice is predicated on equality, that it is predicated on empathy, that it is predicated on the idea that there are things that we can do, and those actions are going to have consequences. And our immediate visceral reaction that the consequences are good may not, in fact, be correct. It's recognizing that we can be wrong that allows us to get to a much more robust and clear sense of justice. The sense of justice that Jay's advocating for isn't justice at all. As I mentioned earlier, this idea of, deserving heaven or deserving hell and getting the other because God decides who's going to be saved and who's not. That's not justice. That's capriciousness. That is arbitrary and subjective in the true sense that it's contingent upon a single mind, a single opinion. There's no solution there. And he goes on to say this:
although it is not uniformly enforced, every day women in China are forced to have abortions. Is this an injustice? No, it is not. At least not in a godless universe. Who are we to judge the utilitarian ethic of another society?
Who are we to judge the utilitarian ethic of another society? Well, we're human beings who recognize that those other people are also human beings. We recognize that people, including us and that other society, may be mistaken, that they can have some bias or prejudice in the foundations of their thought that is preventing proper justice, that is preventing them from seeing that what they're doing is in fact unethical. He's basically saying we don't have any response to moral relativism unless we appeal to God. But that's false too. Moral relativism, the idea that something is right if a society says it's right and no other society has any foundation upon which to judge another, is fundamentally flawed, because secular moral systems, as I would advocate for them, aren't contingent upon any society or any time frame. They are applicable to all societies and time frames, recognizing that we're still doing this situationally. Slavery was always wrong. It's just that the people who acted and supported slavery didn't have the requisite information and understanding and perhaps empathy to realize that slavery was wrong. Their view was based on this idea that they were superior to these people, or they had conquered these people and this was a just penalty. You conquer these individuals, they become subservient to you because that's better than letting them run around so they can come back and attack and kill you and take back what you took from them. And this sort of simplistic view of this is something that we've grown beyond, because we begin to see that human beings need to be treated as equal. There's this idea of a veil of ignorance. Design the system that you're going to live in, not knowing who you're going to be in that system. If you're going to have some people cut a cake, you have one person cut the cake with the knowledge that they are going to get last choice of the pieces. These are ways that you move towards fairness, where you remove yourself from, hey, look, I'm the person who's going to inherit $1 billion at some point. I'm going to be rich and wealthy. And so I'm going to look at the world through that lens to determine how things should be. You automatically deal with biases when you're doing that. And so the attempts to move towards fairness and justice and equality have to try to remove that bias as much as possible. And that's where the veil of ignorance and the idea of cake cutting and other things come in. But appealing to God doesn't solve this either, because if I say the moral codes and ethics that you have imposed are wrong and here's why, I can make an argument and I can show where their thinking is in conflict with itself or with the facts of reality. I can convince people. If my only response is, you're wrong because God says so, I must convert them. It's not a matter of convincing them that they are wrong on some sort of grounds of reason or fairness or equality. It's, you're wrong because God says so. And now we get closer to divine command theory, where if God changes his mind, then all of a sudden something that used to be wrong could be right. It doesn't solve the problem to appeal to a God, even if that God were to exist. Because if there is a God and he shows up right here, right now, and says, Matt, your view on this subject is wrong because it is in conflict with my ethics, that is fundamentally no different from anybody saying that. What is it about this God character that makes it okay for him to impose his moral views on people? Well, how is that supposed to convince me? And I've said before, if there is a God and he's not a humanist, if he doesn't have those sorts of values, I want nothing to do with him, and I don't recognize any authority from him.
I am concerned there might be some people in this room who have no problem with what went on in the Soviet gulags or what is happening in China. It is possible for our moral consciences to become so wounded that we become insensitive to the plight of others. If you are in that camp, I invite you to revisit that unjust, unethical, or immoral thing that was done to you or to someone you love. Are you ready to concede that your sense that the offender was genuinely wrong has no rational standing in an atheist universe?
So this is an interesting statement or concern from Jay here. It's still not an argument. It's not backed up by anything. It's just another assertion. He's concerned that we might have become So our moral consciences may have become so corrupt that we might become indifferent to the plight of people everywhere. You know, that something immoral is happening in some other part of the world, and we just might not care about it. That's a legitimate concern. We are primarily focused on ourselves, and then on the people close to us, and then on the people close to us geographically and temporally, and our concern tends to spread out from there. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily think that what's going on somewhere else is right. It doesn't mean that our moral compass has been poisoned or misdirected to the point that we say, what happens over there is morally right. Again, this is another case for moral relativism. But when he's talking about moral conscience being directed away from what is right, he's talking about it being directed away from God. And the God that he's supposedly advocating for is the God of the Bible, the Christian God. And if we were to use the actions attributed to that God as a kind of a barometer of how we should act morally, then we're talking about a God who demonstrated his power and the truth of his existence to the ancient Egyptians, supposedly, to free the Israelites. But he didn't care about them. He didn't care about their, salvation. This was pointed out in a comment on YouTube, that it's clear that God didn't care about anybody but his chosen people, and he was willing to slaughter and destroy those Egyptians and wasn't concerned slightly about their salvation. So if you talk about our moral compass being polluted to the point where we don't care about certain people because they're not ours, that's the example from Jay's Bible. It's not necessarily the example that results from secular moral ethics. It's not the example that results from humanism. What else did Jay say?
Now you can hold onto the emotional experience of feeling that you were truly wronged, but that's all you have. A painful emotion that actually results from the electrical chemical processes occurring in your brain that is the byproduct of an unplanned and accidental arrangement of atoms in a purposeless universe.
Yeah, that kind of is all you have. Painful experiences resulting from the electrical chemical processes occurring in your brain that's the byproduct of an unplanned universe. Why isn't that enough? I mean, if we're going to be talking about life, the rights to life, the rights that you have in life, the value of human life, the pain that you feel in your brain seems to be a key thing to point to. It's not a matter of just merely pointing to pain or harm. It's more complex than that. But Jay wants to write off the sum total of human experience. The only thing that we're confident actually matters. I don't know if there's an afterlife. I only know that I'm experiencing this life right now. And it doesn't matter to me whether there's a God. This is still precious to me and precious to the people I interact with. And yet Jay wants to pretend that if there is no God, then I'm just a sack of chemicals, and so all I have are these experiences. Okay, I'm a sack of chemicals, and those experiences matter to me and they matter to other people. And whether or not there is a God, we're still sacks of chemicals having experiences. And you believe, Jay, that your God designed this system where we're sacks of chemicals having experiences. You just think that those experiences weren't unplanned, they're planned. And I don't know whether they were unplanned or planned. I don't see any reason to think that they were planned. And the bulk of the evidence shows that they were unplanned, that the universe had no intent to create thinking beings. And at the end of the day, we're both left a sack of chemicals who experience things, and we're talking about those experiences and what matters about them. So I don't see how this is remotely an objection.
The unpleasant consequences of a worldview do not automatically count as a refutation of that worldview. My argument tonight is not that atheism is refuted by its being exposed as lacking any ultimate foundation for morality, human rights, justice, and a host of other things we don't have time to consider. The Christian worldview says that those who profess atheism are actually suppressing the knowledge of God, which they possess. That is why they instinctively believe in many things which cannot be justified in an atheist universe. Try as they might, they cannot construct a rationally consistent worldview which simultaneously comports with human experience, especially that of the human moral conscience, unless they borrow capital from the Christian worldview.
So we've reached the end of Jay's second statement or rebuttal, and we went through it pretty detailed. I think the total was only like a 6 or 7 minute statement, and this is why I'm constantly frustrated that you can say something in 10 seconds that might take 10 minutes to explain why it's wrong. The beginning of his statement I completely agree with. He says the unpleasant consequences of a worldview do not automatically count as a refutation of that worldview. I completely agree. I'm glad that he said that. The problem is, he then says, hey, my argument isn't that atheism is wrong because of this. And we're left expecting him to say, my argument is instead this. But he doesn't actually get to that. He just asserts that atheism has no solution to these problems, which he's not actually demonstrated that these problems are real, or that they need to be solved. He then goes on to say that we're just professing atheists. We actually do secretly believe we have the knowledge of God, and that in order for us to explain these things, we have to borrow from God. I've spent a great deal of time thinking about this statement, and there's a video that I'll end up doing about borrowing from worldviews, because this comes up in issues of morality, and it comes up in issues about reason. The debate that I did with Cy, he's accused us of having to borrow from his worldview, and he uses this same professing atheist language. So there'll be a separate video talking about borrowing from worldviews. But here we've reached the end of his rebuttal, the end of his second statement. And at no point has he specifically defended the Christian God except for here. The Christian worldview says that those who profess atheism, etc., and it's just an assertion. His defense of the Christian worldview is, my worldview says that you're not really an atheist. My worldview says that you actually know there's a God, and that's why you have to borrow from my worldview to solve these problems. The thing is, I'm not trying to solve the problems that Jay thinks are there. I don't have to borrow from his worldview. I've already described my view of justice and rights and objective morality and the right to life. And that the thing that he's complaining about, the thing that he's concerned about, I don't see it as real. My view of all of this is to appeal to nature, the consequences of actions, and what sort of impact that has on individuals and societies and all of us. And how might we best go about figuring out the best ways to live. You don't need a God for any of that. And as I pointed out, a God doesn't actually resolve those problems. So his entire case for the existence of God is a parade of assertions about the consequences of a universe without a God. And one version, an extended version, of a moral argument, which never establishes his case. Doesn't show that there's a problem, doesn't show that it's fixed by his at all, and doesn't show that his is the only way to fix it. But now we need to take a look at my rebuttal. And there were mistakes made. It's not a rebuttal I'm particularly proud of, but I think I did hit some good points while missing a few things, which is why we did this video. So let's take a look at the start of mine.
So now we get to test if what Jay actually said about me is true, because while this is technically the second statement, I viewed it as a rebuttal, so I didn't actually prepare anything, and this is just my first chance to respond to what Jay said. And before we actually start, well, because this isn't part of the argument, I think debates are exactly backward in their time structure, because it's easy to say something in 30 seconds that might take 30 minutes to refute.
Yeah, so I cut that video off to spare you, because there's about 2 minutes of kind of hemming and hawing. There's a side note about frustration with debates, and then there's this statement of I didn't come prepared to give a full lecture on morality, but I will. I don't like anything really about that 2 minutes. I know that it was that it helped me connect with the audience and showing some of the frustrations. But here's the thing, and I'm not going to go into detail on my entire rebuttal. I mean, I'm not necessarily going to be the best person to address my own mistakes, and I'm certainly not going to be the best one to say, oh, this is the most awesome thing I've ever said. So I had about 6 or 7 minutes, I think, and I wasted 2 of them kind of rambling and babbling. And then I managed to get my head wrapped around this and figured out some of the things that I wanted to say. Because there's a lot to address. As you've seen, I've already spent I don't know how many minutes here talking about what he said in both of his statements. And I started off with a quick statement that exposed or highlighted the flaw in Jay's position. And that's here.
So, in a nutshell, Jay's position is that God must exist, otherwise Jay's living in a world that doesn't match the world he wants to live in. That really is the summation.
So when I finally got my head wrapped around what I wanted to say, I pretty much started with that. This idea that Jay's entire argument boils down to, if there is no God, he's not living in the kind of world he wants to live in. I chose that over explicitly saying, his entire argument is a fallacious appeal to consequences. Because identifying fallacies by name isn't often as good as explaining them. It is a fallacious appeal to consequences. Jay's view of the world is he really needs there to be objective, transcendent, sourced human rights, human right to life, human values, a foundation for morality, all of this, because he is terrified of the consequences of, well, if that's not true, then everything's fair game, anything goes. And that's because he hasn't actually sat down and he didn't listen or pay much attention to or respond to my views on morality. He begins and ends with his own. He was taught, as I was taught, that without a God, anything is permissible. Well, with a God, anything is permissible in the context that we're dealing with permissibility. Without a God, people could run around killing each other. And you know what? With a God, they could run around and kill each other. People are running around killing each other. That is separate from whether or not they have a moral justification to doing so. And if we're going to narrow moral justification to be, this is what God wants, or this is what is consistent with God's character, or something along those lines, we've made a number of terrible mistakes. We've left no room for growth. We have not increased human understanding on the subject one bit. And we have cited a foundation that we cannot investigate at all. I have no pathway to find out what God actually thinks or wants. Oh yeah, we have holy books and we have people who pretend to speak on behalf of God, but none of those are justification for what God thinks. And, as I pointed out earlier, what God thinks is irrelevant. Because if a God advocated that slaughtering your child is morally correct, he's a monster. He's not a moral being. We get back to the Euthyphro dilemma. Is something pious or morally correct in this context because God says so? Or does God say so because it's morally pious or morally correct? If it's the former, then all of morality is capriciousness. God could say, hey, it's moral to kill now, it's moral to rape, it's moral to pillage, and it would be so. And morality becomes meaningless. It becomes nothing more than the arbitrary dictates of one subjective consciousness. And if the latter is true, that God or gods say that something is moral because it already is, then God and gods are irrelevant to morality because they're just the messenger. We can, at least hypothetically, discover the truth about right and wrong to the extent that there would be a truth without a God. Pointing to the messenger doesn't do anything to edify my understanding of the message. Now, I went on and I commented on Jay's comparison or attempt to equate the atheist system in Soviet Russia with modern secularism?
Secular isn't some monolithic, all-inclusive thing. The fact that one particular view is secular doesn't mean that it's consistent with another secular view, which I think Jay would actually agree with, since he's talking about subjective views. So to try to pit the atrocities of Soviet Russia or any other secular government up against what modern secularists are talking about with respect to morality is almost unconscionable. What they had in Russia was something akin to religion. You need something very much like religion, something dogmatic, which is that the state is God, in order to impose those things. And Jay continually refers to atheism as if it's something, as if it's a worldview. It's not. Atheism is not my worldview. Atheism is my position on the question of the existence of God. It is derived from my worldview, one of my labels for worldview, which is skepticism, and it is consistent with my secular humanism. And when I'm talking about secular morality, I'm talking about something along the lines of secular humanism, and I defy anyone to demonstrate that Soviet Russia was secular humanist.
And I think that's an important distinction to be made. It's completely unfair to say that because this individual or government was atheist, that the policies that they implemented and the actions that they took reflect upon atheism as the source of this, because they had to create something akin to religion where the state is God or your leaders are God in order to impose these things. These were dogmatic regimes that had nothing to do with secular values, nothing to do with secular humanism for sure. And equating them shows that Jay really isn't honestly approaching this subject or hasn't considered it seriously. Because it would be like me saying, hey, witch burning. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. This is what you get when you have Christianity, witch burning. The Crusades. You can't go back and do that, because what you have to show is that the actions were directly derived from the principles imposed by that doctrine. And atheism isn't a doctrine, it's a position on a single issue. Is there a God? It doesn't have a worldview encapsulated. It doesn't tell you anything about ethics. For that, I go to secular humanism, and etc. The problem is, if you start going down that road, as Jay's done, not only are you making a mistake equating your opponent's secular humanism with an atheist regime that was imposing a God-free religious model, but you've opened the door now for me to go back to the witch burning, as I mentioned, because that doctrine is expressly in there. You can go to Christianity's source of information, the Bible, and find the passage that says, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And that is a clear instruction that it ties the doctrine to the action. There's no doctrine of atheism that has a statement that you can tie the actions of Soviet Russia to, that then serves as an indictment of atheism. So it's a double mistake on Jay's part to do this, and it lost him the audience, and that's one of the reasons why I addressed it. There's one more thing, one more comment in my rebuttal that I want to address, and then we'll close this up and move on to cross-examination.
Jay talks about this innate awareness of morality that we have. Well, these moral instincts that we supposedly have don't all seem to agree. And they not only don't agree now, you can go to people and ask them what they think about a particular issue that's a moral issue, and you can get a variety of different answers. They don't match up with respect to time. What was immoral 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago has changed. That doesn't mean that what is truly moral has changed. What we're talking about changing here is what those people's perceptions of morality is, or perceptions are. I do that sometimes.
And of everything I said in the rebuttal, this is probably one of my favorite things, because the truth is that what we view as moral now is different from what it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And that difference needs to be explained. Christians, some of them, would explain that we are given over to reprobate minds and that we used to have a pure understanding of God's view of morality, and we have now drifted away from it. And so we are less moral now, and the world is worse off now. My view is that we are better off now. And when you read like Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature, it shows that the world is getting better. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. We've moved away from prayer and God, and everything's getting worse. We live in the best possible times. We live in times when human atrocities are on the decline. It doesn't mean they've gone away. It doesn't mean we've solved all the problems with human nature. But the fact that our views about morality are different now is damning to Jay's position, and specifically to Christian notions about morality. Not because I, as an atheist, have what I think is a superior moral view to the Bronze and Iron Age people who wrote these books, but because Christians today have different moral views than Christians of the past. That despite what they might say about their holy book or their personal relationship with a God who instructs them in moral evaluations, what many Christians consider to be moral is markedly different from what many Christians in the past considered to be moral. And so now the argument that they have to accept is that Christians also are moving further and further away from God. Are they doing it for good reasons or bad? I think by and large they're doing it for good reasons. And when we can demonstrate that the life expectancy and health and happiness and the social ills that we measure in society are generally on the decline, that we generally live in one of the best of all times, the idea that we should go backward to the lesser understanding of our ancestors who wrote books claiming that you shouldn't allow a witch to live, and that if you mix fabrics, it's an abomination. You shouldn't eat shellfish. That these were moral issues that offended a God. That's perverse. And I know we're not going to agree on that. But the difference here is that whether morals, rights, justice are subjective or not, we can make a case for why our view is better. The only case that Jay makes for why his view is better is that he doesn't want it to be another way. We didn't even get to the specifics of, okay, what moral issue do you and I disagree on and why? What is the foundation that I have for not killing people versus your foundation? Thou shalt not kill. What good is that? What information did that impart to humanity? I didn't need any being to dictate a stone tablet to tell me that it was wrong to kill people. I was able to suss that on my own, and for better reasons than because I said so. In the next video, we'll take a look at the cross-examination period, which is my favorite, and which may require less commentary than the previous two. I'm not sure yet. But there were some moments in here that I really liked, and it's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this video next. So we'll see you next time with the cross-examination. Bye-bye. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.